He had it all: money, power, absolute control over his life, until a simple mechanical failure left him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Little did Samuel know that this deserted road would mark the beginning of a journey that would shatter his perfect world and rebuild it with something he never imagined he needed. Samuel woke up as he did every day, to the sound of his phone vibrating relentlessly on the nightstand. The bedroom, minimalist and impeccably organized, reflected his life. Every detail was under control, or so he liked to believe. In truth, things had been falling apart inside him, but ignoring it was easier than facing it. Messages about contracts and meetings were already awaiting his attention, reminding him there was no room for weakness in his world. He was the kind of man who believed hard work was the answer to everything. His accomplishments came at the cost of sleepless nights and goals achieved at the expense of his health. The emptiness? Just a temporary pause before the next big project, or at least that's what he told himself. Deep down, though, something corrosive was growing. A nagging feeling that all those achievements might not mean as much as he thought. The big city, with its skyscrapers and blinking lights, seemed always to match his frenetic pace. Samuel was a respected man, even feared, but barely known for who he truly was. The truth was, he had never bothered to find out himself. His life was on rails, and derailing was unthinkable. After all, control was everything. But control over what? That was a question he wouldn't let himself answer. That specific day, however, something different was in the air. A business trip was taking him to a distant town, a place he couldn't even find on the map without GPS. Just another meeting, he thought, something simple and routine. Still, there was a discomfort he couldn't explain, as if something was about to change, and he had no power over it. The road stretched long, winding through fields and hills, a stark contrast to the metropolitan chaos he was used to. The windows of his luxury car reflected the pastoral landscape, but Samuel was too absorbed in emails and spreadsheets to notice. He refused to waste time as always. But at that moment, fate had other plans, and there was no cell phone signal to help him. The engine started to sputter, disrupting the constant melody of work. Impatient, Samuel smacked the steering wheel as if that could fix the problem. The car came to a complete stop, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of silence. No control, no immediate solution, and for the first time in a long time, no idea what to do. Helplessness hit him like a punch to the gut. Taking a deep breath, he tried to rationalize. It's just a mechanical issue, he told himself. Someone will show up, or the cell phone signal will return. But nothing happened. The silence was overwhelming, and the sense of powerlessness began to chip away at his superficial calm. He didn't even know where to start. Sitting in the car, Samuel stared at the empty road, feeling the weight of his own solitude. Hours passed, or at least they seemed to. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange that Samuel didn't stop to admire. He was lost in his thoughts, a mix of frustration and despair. For the first time, he realized how much he depended on everything he had built to keep his sense of control intact. And now, without any of it, he was just a man, vulnerable and exposed. Something needed to happen, and soon. The control he valued so much seemed to disintegrate along with the daylight. But as the last spark of hope faded, the sound of a bicycle approaching broke the silence. Samuel lifted his head, both intrigued and relieved. He didn't know it yet, but the simple figure coming down the road was about to change his life. Samuel didn't expect to hear that sound, the creak of a bicycle, the soft click of pedals, and a warm voice asking, "Need some help?" When he looked up, he saw Melanie, a young woman in simple clothes, with a smile that stood in stark contrast to his sense of despair. Her presence felt as improbable as it was magical, as if she had appeared out of nowhere. He blinked, confused, and almost instinctively refused, but he had no other choice. Melanie leaned her bike against the car and assessed the situation with impressive calm, while Samuel tried to hide his embarrassment. He couldn't believe that someone with improvised tools and a casual attitude could fix something he considered a complete disaster. "Mind if I take a look under the hood?" she asked, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Samuel hesitated, but eventually nodded. As she worked, Samuel watched her, arms crossed, biting his tongue to keep from questioning her. It was as if Melanie had a natural control over the situation, something that both bothered and fascinated him. He, who always relied on expensive professionals and cutting-edge technology, now depended on a stranger with a screwdriver and a determined gaze. The discomfort was palpable, but so was a spark of curiosity he couldn't ignore. "Where are you from?" Melanie asked as she adjusted something under the hood. Samuel hesitated. How could he summarize his life of luxury and corporate pressure to someone who seemed so far removed from that world? "The big city," he replied, his tone tinged with arrogance, even to his own ears. Melanie just smiled faintly, as if that detail were irrelevant. "Well, out here, we make do with what we have." Samuel fell silent, unsettled by the simplicity of her words. There was no cynicism, no judgment, just a quiet acceptance of reality, something he didn't understand but was beginning to admire. When she turned the key and the engine roared back to life, he was momentarily speechless. Relief mixed with disbelief. She had done it with simple tools and an unwavering confidence. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, trying to regain control of the situation in the only way he knew, with money. Melanie shook her head, smiling gently. "It's nothing. Just do the same for someone else one day." Samuel blinked, surprised. He was used to clear transactions and defined objectives, but her response completely disarmed him. Something stirred within him, a feeling he barely recognized: gratitude. Melanie got back on her bike, leaving Samuel standing by his car. As she pedaled away down the road, he remained rooted to the spot, confused and motionless. What had just happened? Why did it feel so different from every other interaction he'd ever had? It wasn't just her altruistic act that struck him, but what he saw in her eyes, a strength that didn't come from money but from something far deeper. As he started the car and drove back onto the road, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about Melanie. Who was she? Why did she care? The questions echoed in his mind like an uncomfortable mantra. He, who believed he controlled everything, was beginning to sense that something more powerful was at play. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to sit with the uncertainty. Samuel had no idea that this casual encounter would mark the beginning of a transformation he could never have imagined. Melanie hadn't just fixed his car's engine. She had planted a seed in his heart, one that would start to grow, reshaping everything he believed about control, surrender, and the true meaning of life's lessons. What unsettled Samuel the most wasn't just being stranded in the middle of nowhere, dependent on a stranger, but the calmness with which Melanie handled the situation. She tinkered with the engine expertly, using tools that seemed straight out of an old movie, while he crossed his arms and glanced around, visibly uncomfortable. "Do you really think you can fix it?" he asked, unable to mask the doubt in his voice. Melanie looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Would you rather wait a few more hours for help or trust me?" The question lingered in the air, charged with a simplicity that left him speechless. Samuel wasn't used to depending on anyone, let alone someone who seemed so improvised. He almost said he'd wait, but the emptiness of the road and the quickly setting sun made him reconsider. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Fine, do what you can." It felt like swallowing a piece of pride far too large to go down easily. He wanted to make sure she knew just how skeptical he was, but Melanie didn't seem to care. She continued working, unbothered by his mistrust. To Samuel, that was more unsettling than anything else. As she worked on the engine, he tried to make conversation, but it was as if Melanie was in another world. "Do you do this often? Helping complete strangers?" he asked, with a hint of irony. "Only when they need it," she replied without taking her eyes off the engine. Samuel almost laughed, but something in her response hit him. There was a sincerity he couldn't quite understand, and maybe because of that, it annoyed him. Samuel's discomfort wasn't just with Melanie. It was with the entire situation. He, who had always maintained absolute control over everything, was now entirely at the mercy of a young woman with a bike and improvised tools. No phone, no assistance, no spreadsheets to save him this time. It was a direct confrontation with something he had avoided for years, his own vulnerability. And he hated every second of it. When Melanie finally managed to get the engine running, Samuel felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. He thanked her mechanically, unable to hide his discomfort. He offered her money again, almost as a way to regain some control over the situation. But Melanie refused once more, with that smile that seemed to dismantle all his attempts at asserting authority. "Just don't forget to help someone if you get the chance," she said before leaving. Samuel stood there, looking at his now functional car, but feeling as if something was still out of place. He wanted to dismiss the encounter as a random event, something unworthy of his thoughts. But he couldn't. Melanie's refusal, her self-sufficiency, and the way she seemed to want nothing in return, all of it left him unsettled. How could someone live like that, without trying to control everything? As he drove back to the city, Samuel tried, unsuccessfully, to push away the nagging feeling. He wanted to believe the encounter meant nothing, that it was just a resolved inconvenience. But deep down, he knew he was wrong. Something inside him had shifted, something he couldn't name. And no matter how hard he tried to escape the thought, Melanie's image kept resurfacing in his mind. The next day, Samuel couldn't focus on anything. He pretended to be present in meetings, but his mind wandered back to that road, to the sound of the engine starting again, and to Melanie's calm smile. Against all his instincts, he felt an inexplicable need to see her again. He didn't know why, but he needed to understand what had happened. Samuel was determined. The following day, he got into his car and, without consulting maps or apps, let his instincts guide him back to that cafe. Something in him wouldn't let him simply move on, as he did with everything else in his life. Her name, Melanie, echoed in his thoughts, irritating and irresistible. He had to understand. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, though he couldn't yet define what. The cafe was small, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. When Samuel walked in, the doorbell announced his presence, and a few curious glances turned his way. The decor was modest but welcoming, with the smell of fresh coffee and homemade bread filling the air. He felt out of place, as though he'd stumbled into a world that didn't belong to him. And then he saw her, behind the counter, arranging mugs as if it were the most important task in the world. Melanie noticed him before he could say anything. "You again?" she asked, her smile a mix of surprise and amusement. Samuel cleared his throat, slightly embarrassed. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, feeling ridiculous for saying something so simple. Melanie raised an eyebrow as if to say, "You already did." But instead of brushing him off, she pointed to a table by the window. "Take a seat. I'll be with you in a minute." He obeyed, feeling a bit childish, like a student sent to the corner. His eyes wandered around the cafe as he waited. It was so different from his world, so far removed from the steel and glass of his routine. When Melanie finally approached with a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, her unassuming kindness left him disarmed. "On the house?" she said before he could ask the price. "Are you always like this?" Samuel asked, a little more confident, taking a sip of coffee. Melanie laughed. "Like what?" He hesitated. "So, carefree?" She shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "You learn to make do with what you have." To Samuel, that was practically a riddle. A man who planned every detail of his life, he didn't know how to process such a philosophy of acceptance. The conversation continued, light and surprisingly comfortable. Melanie spoke about the cafe, her regular customers, the challenges of keeping everything running, and how much she loved the place. Samuel, on the other hand, found himself talking more than he expected, not about business or numbers, but about small things he hardly noticed in his own life. It was as if her presence broke through some invisible barrier. Then Carrie appeared. Melanie's younger sister, with her hair tied back in a messy ponytail and eyes sparkling with curiosity, approached timidly. "Are you the guy with the broken car?" she asked, her mischievous smile breaking the tension. Samuel laughed, something rare for him, and nodded. "I am." Carrie seemed anything but intimidated. She spoke to him as if they'd known each other for years. For reasons he couldn't explain, the simplicity of the interaction touched him deeply. As Melanie returned to work and Carrie moved to doodle at the counter, Samuel found himself alone, watching the cafe's quiet activity. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. It wasn't the kind of tranquility that came from closing a big deal or achieving a goal. It was something more human, more genuine. And somehow, he knew he needed that feeling again. When it was time to leave, Melanie walked him to the door. "You have a way of overcomplicating things, don't you?" she said with a smile that was neither accusatory nor condescending. Samuel chuckled, unsure of why. She disarmed him effortlessly. As he walked back to his car, he realized something inside him had shifted. Samuel couldn't stay away. The next morning, he returned to the cafe. There was something about the place, or perhaps about Melanie, that drew him in. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but every moment there seemed to offer answers to questions he hadn't yet formed. When he walked in, he found Melanie setting up tables while Carrie swept the floor with an energy that felt almost contagious. It was such a stark contrast to the weightiness of his world. Melanie noticed him before he could speak. "Back again, Samuel?" she asked, crossing her arms, though her smile softened any pretense of annoyance. He shrugged. "The pie was good. Maybe I came back for that." She laughed, not the shallow laugh he was used to at corporate dinners, but something genuine, like everything about her. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of the world lighten. This time, Melanie invited him to sit at the counter, where she continued her work while they talked. Carrie, ever curious, made it her mission to join the conversation, interrupting with unexpected questions. "Do you have kids?" she asked, swinging her legs as she perched on a stool beside Samuel. He hesitated. "No, I've never had time for that." Carrie frowned, as if the logic didn't compute. "Everyone has time for family," she retorted with the disarming simplicity of a child. Samuel chuckled, but her words lingered. As he watched the sisters interact, Melanie with her practical patience and Carrie with her boundless energy, he began to notice something. There was a connection between them, a bond he had never experienced. In his life of luxury and goals, relationships were transactions. Here, they were the foundation of everything. And the more time he spent there, the more he felt he had missed something essential. Melanie, however, seemed skeptical. "What do you really want, Samuel?" she asked, drying a cup as she looked at him directly. He didn't have a ready answer, something rare for a man who always had a plan. "I don't know," he admitted, surprising even himself. Melanie studied him for a moment, as if trying to decipher him. Then she shrugged. "Well, until you figure it out, you can enjoy the pie." She returned to her work, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As the cafe filled with customers, Samuel found himself observing the people who came in. Each one seemed to know Melanie and Carrie, exchanging warm greetings and quick stories. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen something like that. It was as if this small community was a parallel universe where people genuinely cared for one another. The thought both unsettled and fascinated him. When the cafe quieted down, Melanie finally had a moment to sit. "You seem out of place here, you know," she commented without malice. Samuel nodded with a small smile. "I suppose I am." He didn't feel ashamed to admit it, not here, not with her. There was something freeing about not having to pretend. Melanie didn't expect him to be anything other than who he was, and that was a novelty for him. Carrie appeared with a sketchbook, insisting that Samuel pick the best drawing. He found himself laughing as he analyzed each scribble, offering his opinions like an expert in children's art. It was such a simple interaction, but it made him feel something he couldn't name. When Carrie hugged him, thanking him for his fair judgment, Samuel realized he didn't want to leave. Not yet. At the end of the day, Melanie walked him to the door. "You know you can't run from this, right?" she said, half laughing, half serious. Samuel wasn't sure exactly what she meant, but something inside him knew she was right. As he walked to his car, he felt a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. The world that once felt so distant from his own was beginning to feel like an invitation. The next morning, Samuel woke up with a single thought in his mind. He wanted to help. He wasn't sure if it was guilt over Melanie's evident discomfort whenever he showed up at the cafe or the connection he felt with Carrie, but his decision was made. He arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, bringing a proposal. He wanted to help Melanie renovate the house where she and her sister lived. It was a simple offer but loaded with complex intentions he didn't fully understand himself. Melanie gave him a serious look, as though trying to measure what lay behind the gesture. "Why would you do this?" she asked, skeptical. Samuel hesitated. He didn't have a clear answer, but there was sincerity in his tone. "Because I can. And because I want to." Her suspicion was understandable, but there was also a flicker of hope she tried to hide. It was hard to refuse help when the walls of your home threatened to crumble. Carrie, on the other hand, was thrilled. "You're going to fix our roof?" she asked, her eyes shining. Samuel laughed. "I'll try." Her genuine excitement motivated him even more, but it also brought a new pressure. He needed to meet their expectations. This wasn't just a financial commitment. He wanted to be present, a concept far outside his comfort zone. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. Convincing Melanie wasn't easy. Life had taught her that promises often came with a price, and she feared what might be hidden behind Samuel's generosity. But eventually she gave in. "Okay, you can help. But no big gestures, nothing over the top," she said, setting boundaries to protect something deeper. Samuel agreed without argument. He understood that he was stepping into unknown territory. As Samuel began planning the renovation, challenges quickly emerged. He knew nothing about manual labor or construction materials, and his attempt to hire a professional team was met with a reproachful look from Melanie. "If you want to help, really help," she said. He realized she didn't want a ready-made solution. She wanted to see effort, participation. And so, he found himself holding tools he'd never used in his life. Gradually, Samuel began to adapt. He spent mornings at the cafe, helping Melanie between tasks, and afternoons working on the house, learning from the local community, who, to his surprise, started volunteering to help. Each hammer strike, each wall painted, seemed to unearth something new within him. It was exhausting, but in a way he had never experienced before. For the first time, he felt the direct impact of his work. Meanwhile, Samuel's allies and adversaries emerged in unexpected ways. Melanie was a mix of both. She challenged him, tested his patience, but also inspired him with her determination. Carrie was his greatest ally, always present with funny remarks and infectious enthusiasm. But Samuel's greatest enemies weren't external, they were internal. Doubts, fear of failure, and the constant feeling of being out of place were battles he faced every day. Samuel's colleagues back in the city didn't understand what he was doing. Messages piled up on his phone, filled with questions about postponed meetings and pending contracts. He knew he was pulling away from everything he once considered important, but for the first time, he felt it wasn't so important after all. Each day in the small town brought him closer to something real, something he had never sought before. Samuel still didn't know how it would all end, but he was beginning to see it didn't matter. He was learning to value the process, something he'd never done before. And though there was still much work ahead, there was also something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Days turned into weeks, and Melanie and Carrie's house began to take shape. Samuel, who initially didn't know how to hold a hammer, now felt confident repairing beams and sanding walls. But it wasn't just the house that was changing. With every hammer strike, Samuel felt he was rebuilding something inside himself, something he hadn't even realized was broken. And, strangely, that no longer frightened him. Neighbors started to show up, some with borrowed tools, others with stories to share. Samuel, who had always prided himself on being reserved and distant, began to feel part of the community. He laughed at their jokes, listened to their advice, and even shared a few stories of his own. For the first time, he felt no need to hide. The sense of belonging was new and frighteningly good. Melanie, however, remained a mystery. Despite all his help, she kept a barrier Samuel couldn't seem to cross. There were moments when she seemed completely at ease, laughing and working alongside him. At other times, her distant gaze suggested she still didn't fully trust his intentions. This challenged him in a way he'd never experienced before. He wanted her to believe in him, but he knew he couldn't force it. Carrie, however, had no reservations. The little girl seemed to have adopted Samuel as part of her daily life. She ran around the house under renovation, lugging paint buckets that were far too heavy for her and trying to mimic Samuel's every move. "You're my hero," she declared one day after he hung a shelf in her freshly painted bedroom. It made him laugh, but it also brought a warmth to his chest he hadn't felt in years. Over time, Samuel began noticing the stories hidden in the house. The old furniture, the marks on the walls, the small details that said more than Melanie ever would. He realized it wasn't just about physical repairs. The house was a reflection of Melanie's struggles and resilience. And the more he uncovered, the more he wanted to be part of that story, not as an intruder, but as someone who could help write the next chapter. One evening, after a long day of work, Melanie handed him a beer on the newly repaired porch. "Why are you really here, Samuel?" she asked, finally looking him in the eye. He took a while to answer. There were so many reasons, but none he could articulate. "Because it makes me feel alive," he finally said. Melanie stayed silent, but something in her expression suggested she was beginning to believe him. The porch, illuminated by a single hanging bulb, felt like a portal to something greater. Samuel looked up at the sky, the stars shining brighter than he remembered. "I never used to look at the sky," he admitted. "I always thought it was a waste of time." Melanie laughed softly. "Out here, time isn't something you waste. It's something you live." The words hit him deeply, like a truth he had never allowed himself to hear. Samuel began to realize that his old world, filled with numbers and goals, seemed small and insignificant compared to the vastness of that sky or the warmth of that community. The house he was helping to rebuild wasn't just a physical shelter. It was a symbol of everything he had lost: simplicity, connection, humanity. He didn't know how, but he felt he was getting closer to something that gave his life meaning. The work continued, but Samuel's real challenge lay within. He knew that at some point he would have to face the hard questions. What would he do when the renovation was finished? Would he return to his old life, or find a way to carry what he'd learned with him? It was a question he didn't yet have the courage to answer, but it loomed closer every day. At some point, Samuel realized he had fully immersed himself in Melanie and Carrie's routine. The man who once avoided anything uncalculated or unpredictable now woke up early to saw wood, paint walls, and even sweep the cafe floor on occasion. He had never felt so exhausted or so alive. There was something about the physical effort, the sweat, that quieted his ever-racing mind. Melanie remained his greatest challenge. Not in terms of work, they had become an unlikely but efficient team. It was emotionally that she tested him. Even after weeks of working side by side, Samuel could feel she kept a part of herself protected, as though she couldn't trust him completely. "You're going to leave when this is all done, aren't you?" she asked one day while they painted a wall together. The question hit him like an unexpected blow. "I haven't thought about it," he replied honestly. For the first time in years, he was living day by day without spreadsheets or defined goals. But the thought of leaving, of walking away from Melanie and Carrie, tightened his chest in a way he didn't know how to explain. She didn't respond, simply kept painting, but he saw in her eyes that she expected him to go, that she was preparing herself for it. Carrie, on the other hand, seemed to have fully embraced Samuel as part of her life. "You're going to stay forever, right?" she asked, holding a piece of wood as he sought it. Her innocence completely disarmed him. "I don't know, Carrie," he said, avoiding promises he couldn't keep. But her question echoed in his mind for the rest of the day. For the first time, he began to wonder what it would mean to stay. The routine at the cafe and the renovation became a ritual. Samuel learned to appreciate the repetition of the days, the predictability that once bored him but now felt comforting. He found himself smiling at regular customers, listening to their stories, and even remembering their names. It was as if, little by little, he was being accepted as part of that small universe. And it made something inside him expand. The most challenging moment came when a heavy rainstorm threatened their progress. A newly repaired section of the roof started leaking, and Samuel, Melanie, and a few neighbors worked frantically to protect what they'd built. As he carried buckets to divert the water, Samuel felt something he'd never experienced before: fear of losing something that truly mattered. The house was more than just a structure. It was a symbol of trust and shared effort. That night, exhausted and drenched, Melanie collapsed into a chair in the living room. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you," she said, not looking at him. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to tell her he was doing it for them, that something inside him had changed since meeting her and Carrie, but the words wouldn't come. "You're welcome," he said instead, sitting down beside her in silence, listening to the rain. When the storm passed and the sun returned, something in Melanie seemed to shift. She began letting Samuel in on small details of her life. She told him about the sacrifices she'd made to care for Carrie, about the days when everything felt unbearable but she kept going because she had no other choice. Samuel listened in silence, overwhelmed by her strength and determination. It was as though, by learning more about her story, he was also discovering himself. The roof was repaired once again, but something far more significant happened that week. Samuel realized that the house, the renovation, the cafe, none of these were the real challenge. The true test was letting go of control, accepting that he couldn't save Melanie and Carrie as if they were a project. All he could do was be there, present, and that was harder than anything he'd ever done. The day the renovation was completed arrived with a mix of celebration and melancholy. The house, which once seemed on the verge of collapse, now radiated life. Freshly painted walls reflected the sunlight, the roof was sturdy, and the small garden out front was beginning to bloom. Samuel stood in front of the entrance, taking in the results of the work that had consumed his past weeks. It was more than just a material accomplishment. It was a symbol of something much greater. Melanie stood beside him, arms crossed, as if critically assessing the repairs. "It looks good," she finally said with a small, shy smile. For someone who rarely gave compliments, it was a big moment. Samuel simply nodded, feeling a wave of pride he couldn't remember experiencing before. Carrie, on the other hand, was beaming with joy, running from room to room and showing off every detail of the house as though she were a tour guide. During the small celebration the neighbors organized to mark the completion of the renovation, Samuel noticed something that deeply moved him. The house wasn't just a physical space, it was a home. A place where laughter echoed, where stories were shared, and where people genuinely cared for one another. He realized that he hadn't just built walls, he had helped strengthen the bonds that kept this small family together. Melanie, who rarely expressed her emotions openly, pulled him aside during the festivities. "I know you didn't have to do this. And I know it wasn't easy for you. But I want you to know it means a lot. To me, to us." Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone with something Samuel had never seen in her before: vulnerability. He smiled, trying to keep things light. "I think I've learned as much as I've helped." Carrie joined them mid-conversation, handing Samuel a drawing. It was a simple yet touching depiction of their newly restored house, with him, Melanie, and Carrie standing on the porch. "This is you in our home," she explained with the innocent enthusiasm of a child. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to say, so he just hugged her. In that moment, it all made sense. He had found something he never knew he was looking for. As the party continued, Samuel reflected on everything he had learned. He, who had always believed success lay in control and planning, discovered that life's true value was in human connections, in the ability to give and receive help, and in the simplicity of being present. Melanie and Carrie had shown him something his luxurious life never could: purpose. Later, as the sun set, Melanie approached him again. "So, what are you going to do now?" she asked, as though reading his mind. Samuel looked at her, realizing he didn't have a ready answer. But for the first time, that didn't scare him. He knew the next step would be different from anything he had ever planned. "I'm still figuring that out," he said with a calm smile. The renovated house was a tangible reward, but the true gift lay within Samuel. He felt a peace he had never experienced, as though something inside him had finally aligned. The sense of completeness didn't come from what he had given but from what he had received, the chance to reconnect with himself and others. And as the night fell, he realized he didn't want it to end. But, as with everything in life, this moment was also a point of transition. He knew he needed to decide what his next chapter would be. And though the thought of leaving Melanie and Carrie saddened him, there was something inside that told him this wasn't a definitive goodbye. Samuel was ready to carry these lessons with him wherever he went. On his last night at Melanie and Carrie's newly renovated home, Samuel sat on the porch, gazing at the stars. The silence felt different from that night on the road, when everything seemed to be falling apart. Now, he felt peace, a feeling so rare in his life that it almost confused him. Melanie joined him, bringing 2 cups of tea. "Gonna miss the hard labor?" she asked, her smile a mix of humor and affection. He laughed, taking the cup. "More than I probably should." But the truth was more complicated. He knew he would miss much more than the work. He'd miss the mornings at the cafe, the casual conversations with Melanie, and Carrie's laughter echoing through the house. Above all, he'd miss the sense of belonging, something he had never experienced before coming here. The next morning, he packed his bags, a task that felt far heavier than it should. Carrie insisted on helping, tucking small drawings into his luggage so you won't forget us. Each gesture reminded Samuel just how much these 2 had come to mean to him. Melanie watched from a distance, her expression a mix of pride and sadness. She didn't say anything, but he could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air. When it came time to leave, Samuel hesitated. He knew he needed to return to his life, but something was pulling him to stay. Melanie, ever practical, stepped forward. "You have your world to go back to, Samuel. And we have ours." Her words were firm, but her tone held a softness that made him realize she was trying to make his departure easier. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. In the car, Samuel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Melanie and Carrie waving from the porch. For a moment, he thought about stopping, getting out, and telling them he didn't want to leave. But he knew life didn't work like that. Some goodbyes were necessary, even when they hurt. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, he took a deep breath. That road, which once felt like a place of despair, now symbolized the way back to something different. As he drove, messages and notifications began to flood his phone. Contracts, meetings, figures, all of it felt distant and irrelevant after everything he'd experienced. He realized he couldn't simply return to his old life as if nothing had happened. Something inside him had shifted, and he needed to find a way to incorporate that into his reality. The road ahead felt longer than ever, but he knew it was a journey he had to take. Back in the city, the contrast hit him like a tidal wave. The towering buildings, incessant noise, and relentless pace felt suffocating. He tried to pick up his old routine, but nothing fit the way it had before. He missed Melanie's simple coffee, the community stories, and Carrie's infectious laughter. It was as if disconnecting from that life for a few weeks had revealed something far more valuable. And so, Samuel started to act. First, he dedicated a portion of his resources to creating an educational fund in Carrie's name, ensuring that not only she but other children in the community would have access to opportunities he knew were vital. Then he began looking for ways to bring the values he had learned into his business. His company started investing in social projects, something he had never considered before. It was his way of keeping alive the connection he had found. Above all, Samuel knew he needed to stay connected to Melanie and Carrie. He didn't know exactly how, but he felt those 2 were part of his journey, his transformation. As the car carried him back to the big city, he decided that his story with them was far from over. Something inside him whispered that one day he would return to that road. Returning to the big city brought more challenges than Samuel had anticipated. He tried to dive back into the frenetic routine, but everything felt out of place. Meetings seemed hollow, and contracts that once excited him now felt like lifeless paperwork. The Samuel who had left weeks ago was not the same man now walking the halls of his company. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to be. People around him began to notice the change. Samuel, once known for his rigid control and quick decisions, now listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that veered away from financial focus, probing the impact of the company's decisions on people's lives. His partners found it strange, but Samuel was determined to pursue this new perspective, even without knowing where it would lead. Days turned into weeks, and Samuel started implementing small changes. He directed investments into community projects and encouraged his team to look beyond numbers, focusing on how they could make a real impact. But it wasn't enough. He felt he needed to do more, something that connected his new outlook on life with the roots of where it all began. That small house, those 2 lives that had transformed his own. Then he did something unexpected. He took a weekend to return to the small town. When he arrived at the cafe, Melanie was behind the counter, serving customers with her usual calm. Carrie ran to him as soon as she saw him, throwing herself into his arms with her usual contagious energy. "I knew you'd come back," she exclaimed as he laughed, feeling a relief he hadn't realized he needed. Melanie, however, was more restrained. "Didn't think you'd show up so soon," she said, though the glimmer in her eyes betrayed her indifferent tone. Samuel shrugged. "Figured it was time for some decent coffee," he replied, smiling. But he knew the truth, it wasn't about the house or the cafe. It was about the sense of belonging that place gave him. In the days that followed, Samuel split his time between his company and regular visits to the small town. He became a frequent customer at the cafe and a friend to the community. More importantly, he found a balance he had never had before. He didn't have to choose between the two worlds. He could build a bridge between them. And that bridge began to reshape his life in completely new ways. The man who had arrived on that road, lost and frustrated, no longer existed. Samuel was now someone who understood the value of letting go, of accepting that not everything had to be under control. In a way, he had been reborn with a worldview that went beyond material success. It was liberating. He was no longer just the work-obsessed millionaire. He was someone connected to something greater, something more human. Over time, Samuel also learned to approach Melanie in a way that respected her boundaries. He knew he couldn't fix everything in her life as he had with the house, but that didn't mean he couldn't be present. And slowly, Melanie began to let him in. It was a gradual process, but Samuel was willing to wait. After all, he had learned that the best things in life couldn't be rushed. As months turned into years, Samuel continued his journey. He knew he would never be completely ready or fixed, but that was the beauty of what he had discovered. Life was a constant reconstruction, filled with lessons, moments of surrender, and, above all, connections. And as he watched Carrie sketching in a notebook, with Melanie smiling in the background, he felt a quiet certainty. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The impact of his experience with Melanie and Carrie transformed Samuel from the inside out, and he knew he needed to do something greater with what he had learned. He started with what was closest to his heart, creating opportunities for Carrie and other children in the community. Thus, the Educational Fund was born, a project he enthusiastically funded aimed at providing quality education for children in rural areas. It was his way of giving back all that he had received. The fund was an immediate success, but Samuel didn't want to just send money. He made a point to visit the small town regularly, participating in local events and monitoring the progress of the projects. Each visit to the cafe was a reminder of what truly mattered. Melanie and Carrie were always the first to greet him, and he knew that no matter how busy his life became, that place would always be his anchor. In the big city, Samuel brought the lessons he had learned from that small community into his company. He implemented policies that focused not only on profit but also on social impact. Sustainable projects, community initiatives, and a more human approach to business became the new priorities. At first, his team was skeptical, but gradually, they began to see the value of these changes. Samuel wasn't just leading, he was inspiring. Melanie, on the other hand, continued to challenge him. She never treated Samuel as a hero or savior, something he quietly appreciated. To her, he was simply a man who did the right thing. That perspective kept him grounded, reminding him that his journey was still unfolding. Slowly, their trust grew. There were no grand promises, just shared moments that built a genuine connection. Carrie blossomed with her newfound opportunities. She began attending a better school, filled with enthusiasm and dreams that now felt within reach. Samuel saw in her a joy that inspired him to keep expanding the educational fund. He realized that every child who benefited from the program reflected the impact Melanie and Carrie had on his life. The gift he had found wasn't something to keep for himself, it needed to be shared. Despite all the changes, Samuel knew there was no perfect ending. His journey was ongoing, filled with ups and downs, but now he was ready to face them. He had learned the importance of balancing control and surrender, work and connection, goals and values. And while each day brought new challenges, he felt an inner peace he had never experienced before. In the years that followed, Samuel continued to visit Melanie and Carrie. The cafe became not just a meeting place for him but a hub for the community he so admired. Melanie, ever practical, teased him about showing up more often than the regular customers. He would laugh, knowing she was right, but he didn't care. Those moments were part of the gift he carried with him, a constant reminder that the true wealth of life lay in its people. Samuel no longer worried about where the future would take him. He had found something no contract or number could buy: purpose, connection, and peace. As he sat on Melanie's restored porch, watching Carrie play in the yard, he realized that of all the journeys he had undertaken, this one had been the most important. After all, it wasn't about the destination, it was about the lessons learned along the way.